Now, what we're going to start talking about is God's design for us. I would submit that God has created us for intimacy. First with Him, and then horizontal intimacy within marriage, but in all relationships. It looks a little different from marriage and others, but I submit to you these four fundamental aspects of who we are as human beings. We have an intellectual intimacy to be able to have a discussion of ideas, thoughts, that we are intellectual beings as a part, and to have a relationship with somebody that you can just talk about whatever, ideas, thoughts, and that's an important part of full intimacy. Clearly spiritual, as spiritual beings, to have spiritual intimacy where you can discuss spiritual things and you can impact and relate with God together. This has its highest fulfillment in marriage and human relationships, but in all relationships, that's part of the purpose of us coming Sunday mornings, is to experience spiritual intimacy with the rest of the body, because we're supposed to be connected to the greater body. God never intended for our marriages to fulfill all of our relational needs. It can't. Husbands, there's some relational needs that you have that only a man can meet. And your wife is just not equipped. And you're grateful for that. That was supposed to be a joke. And likewise, wives, there's some relational needs only a woman can meet. And you can try to get that from your husband, and it's not going to be met. Because you're supposed to be, as a marriage, you're supposed to be connected to a larger body that has women in it. But emotional intimacy is the third aspect, because we are emotional beings. We have an emotional side. To connect and experience life on an emotional level is an important part of intimacy. But then on a physical intimacy level as well, which is both sexual and non-sexual. I was specifically talking about marriage. There are some parts of sexual intimacy that's only designed to be expressed within marriage. It's by God's design. And I'm going to say a little bit about understanding God's design. In my office, I have a picture of a locomotive. I talk with couples all the time about it. About a block from my office is train tracks going through downtown Conroe. Locomotive on that train tracks can do incredible things. Hold hundreds of tons behind it. But if you take that same train, that locomotive, and you go 1 mile the opposite direction to Interstate 45, and you put it down in the middle of 45, it'll move, but it's going to tear up the pavement. It's not going to pull hundreds of tons of all of our goods, and it's going to make a huge mess. That locomotive, I use it in a lot of different areas of illustration. But with regard to sexual intimacy, God designed it with tracks. That train doesn't get to decide wherever it wants to go. The locomotive has choices along the way. See, within the tracks, there's choices. But it's designed to go on the tracks. Anything other than what it's designed to do will create a mess. And we see that within physical intimacy. God has designed it for a purpose. That the highest forms of expression in physical intimacy are intended to be between a man and a woman who have covenanted before God and a body to be faithful until death, to honor God in everything, and have given everything to them, that have built a significant level of trust. And that's the tracks. It does incredible things. But even 1 foot off the tracks, that locomotive's going to make a mess. When you understand God's design and you choose to abide by it, because God's given us the ability to take our locomotive off the tracks. He's given us a free will where we can decide to do what we want to do. He tells us, you really want to keep it on the tracks. You really want to do this the way I've designed it to do. But, and for reasons that God Himself knows, when He created us and gave us a free will, He gave us the ability to sin. But if you imagine taking that locomotive and putting it in I-45, how easy would it be for you and me to put a locomotive back on the train tracks? I can't lift a locomotive. In a similar way, when we mess up, when we go outside of God's design, we have to have God's help to put it back. But the God who is all-powerful has the right to say, you messed it up, you fix it. And he would know we can't fix it. But what the incarnation is all about is God saying, I'm going to come help you, because I know you can't do it. And God coming and lifting our locomotive and putting it back on the tracks. And saying, okay, I'm going to make it new. I'm going to fix the wheels, I'm going to do that. Keep it on the tracks this time. Understand that. Because within physical intimacy, there's sexual and non-sexual touch. I'm not going to go in greater depth, but to understand, our society has equated intercourse with intimacy. As husbands and wives, you see that's one part of it, but it's one small part. Intimacy is so much bigger than just intercourse. And understanding that means there's inevitably times where one part is just not going to be possible. If intimacy is equated to only one part, then inevitably many times throughout the course of our marriages and relationships, intimacy's gone. But if we see it the way I believe God has designed it, then if one area goes down, you can increase another area. Okay, like physical intimacy depends on how we feel physically. If you've ever had the flu, a really bad case of the flu, probably don't feel a whole lot like physically intimate. But it's at those times, if you focus on emotional intimacy, I'm not saying this has ever happened, but theoretically, if a person with long hair got the flu and is throwing up over the toilet, gets so sick, and a husband were to hold her hair back and put a cold rag on her head, probably that relationship's going to feel closer at the end of that. It's not really physical intimacy. That was an emotional intimacy that grew when physical intimacy couldn't. If you see each one of these areas as sometimes they're going to be lower in one area, they can be increased in another area. If you look over the life cycle, there's some things, and I'm getting ready to turn 50 on Christmas Day. There's some things my body just can't do now that it used to be able to do when I was 25. I'm guessing 25 years from now, when I'm 75, there's even more things that my body won't be able to do. Now, I'm not just talking physical intimacy, I'm just saying, because I see a lot of smirks on your face. But yes, there's some things you can't do when you get older and older. But I tell you, to be able to have an intellectual intimacy, Terry and I have some really deep conversations. Terry, if you don't know Terry very well, she is a theologian. She exhausts me at sometimes, and just like oh, by the way, and she asked this question, I'm going like, my mind just blew thinking about that question, and that she thinks really deeply at times. Our ability to have deep conversations has really grown over the years, because it wasn't always there. But to see full relational intimacy is what God's created us for. Now, in order to have that, we can't do what comes natural to us. Because what comes natural to us as fallen, sinful people is selfishness. I'm pretty sure every parent in here can agree with me. We never had selfishness classes for our kids. We never sat them down and say, this is the way you grab somebody else's toy and you schwack them on the head. They learned that. We have had lots of classes, and with Nate, we're still having some classes at times, that if you grab Billy's toy and schwack him on the head, he's not going to have anything to do with you. None of the kids are. If you do what you just want to do, nobody's going to want to be around you. So as humans, if we do what comes natural, it won't create intimacy. It'll create isolation. Now, looking at how do we do something unnatural, looking at what we're created for, I believe there's three foundations of healthy relationships. I've had a couple different ways of presenting it over the years, but seeing the very first and most important is trust. Trust is what lets somebody get in close enough to be in a relationship. We're going to talk a lot about trust because when that's been broken, it doesn't repair itself. It needs to be repaired. Once you're able to say, my spouse, the other person in this relationship won't intentionally hurt me, then you can move to the second foundation. If you believe this person will intentionally hurt you, you can't enrich that relationship. Because survival is where that relationship is at. If a person will intentionally harm me, even if it's 1 out of 1,000 times, intentional harm is the biggest break in trust in a relationship, and I have to prepare for it. I have to watch out for it. It often happens in marriage. If it's rare when it happens, but it is significantly bad when it happens, then I need to be on the lookout. It would be a lot easier if we would give a heads up to our spouse when we're about to do something really stupid and hurtful. Like, schedule it. Saturday afternoon, I'm going to walk in and I'm just going to bite your head off for no reason, and I'm going to give a snarky retort to you. You probably would be somewhere else on Saturday afternoon if you knew that was coming. We don't do that. So if it's 1 out of 1,000 times and you have to watch and prepare for it, then what are you missing? Just where you could fill something in if you have to. 999 times that it doesn't. You miss the 999 times that things are done well because you're preparing for this inevitable one from somewhere that is so destructive. But if you have a level of trust that says, okay, you're not going to intentionally hurt me. But even though at times each of us will. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you have that fundamental level of trust, then we can have effective communication. You can't have effective communication without that fundamental level of trust. Because if I share something with you and you use it as a weapon against me, then I learn it's better not to share things with you. But if I don't share things with you, then you can't know what's going on with me. At least until you're able to read minds. Once you're able to read minds, then this all changes. But until you're able to read minds, then the only way what's in your head and your heart is going to get in your spouse's head and heart is you have to communicate that. And everybody communicates. Not everybody communicates well. It's actually pretty simple and very difficult to communicate well. But once you have a fundamental level of effective communication, we are able to identify the problems, then we can move to the third foundation, which is conflict resolution. Conflict revisiting comes natural to us. To have the same argument over and over and over again. And it ends in one of a few ways. One or both of us get tired of arguing and give in, okay, whatever. Or there's a blood-curdling scream from a kid at the other end of the house, we got to go check that out, so argument's over, right? Or we got to go to work, or I don't know if it's ever happened to you, you're driving into the church parking lot and conflict erupts and you can't deal with it right then, so you put it aside, so it's over. Until the spark happens that ignites the flames again. So conflict resolution actually has it over, resolved. Now, you have to do a little bit of each to do the next thing. Trust starts it, but I see it like illustrated on the right, there's levels of it. Kind of if you see a spiral upward, that you do it at a level 1.0, that you have a fundamental level of trust, effective communication, and when you resolve the first thing, then it builds more trust. We actually resolve something, so I can trust you more. That helps me to share deeper and more honest with you, which helps us to solve bigger conflicts. And it's intended to continue to spiral upward to, at the end of a long life together, the only way things can get any better is that we go into the presence of God Himself. That's what marriage is supposed to look like. Just throughout the rest of life, it just, that last moment, the only way it can get any better is to look face to face with God. Think of what that would be like in your relationships. But understanding these three concepts, the three foundations, everything else in relationships is an application of those. If you're struggling in finances, if you're struggling in parenting, dealing with in-laws and friends and all that, if you have these three foundations strong, then you just apply it in those areas. We can have a conversation about anything to find out what's going on in both of our hearts and minds. And then we have the skills to be able to resolve it. Now, why do we do the work of human relationships? It's hard work to do to create intimacy in human relationships. I believe it comes back to the fact that we are made in the image of God. That our value and worth as human beings is in the fact that God made us in his image. In Genesis 1:27, God said, "Let us make man in our image." In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Clearly, we're made in the image of God. Each one of us. And in some way, there's something about husband and wife together that reflect the image of God in a different way than the individuals do. But 8 chapters later, in Genesis 9, verse 6, this is God talking to Noah after the flood. The context of it, God has just wiped out the wickedness, saved Noah and his family. They get off, and God gives them a bunch of new rules. I think it's kind of interesting, like after he cleans everything up, God gave a rule for capital punishment for murder. It says in 9:6 that if a man murders another man, the murderer's life will be taken from him. And then he has a little phrase of explanation, like that's a pretty big consequence. And his little explanation of why such a harsh consequence is simply, for man is made in the image of God. That to attack and murder a person is a direct attack on God, because that person bears his image and has to be met with the highest form of punishment a human can meet another human. Because that human's value comes from the fact that they were made in the image of God. Now consider that for a minute. Made in the image of God. That image belongs to God. It's his image. He could take it away if he wanted to. But Christ's death on the cross is God's definitive statement of whether he would or not. That instead of withdrawing his image, wiping us out, and starting again, which if I'm honest, if I were God, I'd probably do that. That and a bajillion other reasons why I wouldn't make a good God. But God didn't. He said instead that he was going to send his son to be one of us, to live as we live, and to take all the punishment for us, that he won't withdraw his image. Now, I would submit to you that that image comes when we are a human being, when all the DNA of a human being is present at conception. That when that is a human being, God in his God way, and theologians have debated the image of God for thousands of years, so I'm not going to try to settle it for us in a brief moment on this Sunday morning. But to know if we could explain it, that's a small God. It's beyond our understanding, but it's really cool. At that moment, when we were a human being, God stamped his image. And to illustrate the fact that it doesn't have anything to do with something that we've done to impress him, what do you think a fertilized egg could do to impress the God who created the whole universe? So that God would put his image there because he was so impressed. Nothing. It had nothing to do with us. It had everything to do with God's love for us. That God demonstrated that. Even knowing before we were conceived, but that when we became a human being, that we were going to be sinners, that we were going to turn away from him, we were going to sin. He still did that knowing that. That's how much God loves you. and loves me. And that any work you do on building or rebuilding relationships is an act of worship to God. Now I want to hasten into this discussion the reality of part of why I shared my story with you last week. As I mentioned, when I was in the crisis center, I was struggling to grasp that I was there. I shouldn't be there. I visit people who are here. I shouldn't be here. But one of the things that God got through to me during my time there is that I was just like everybody that was there. My brokenness looked a little different than each person there, but all of us were broken. And I realized every one of us as humans are broken. None of us are perfect. And in understanding that none of us have a right to judge another person. We are called to judge the fruits, to inspect fruits of a person's life, because we can't see the inside. We'll come back to that a little bit. God is able to see the inside of us, but we can't see the inside of another person. But when you see, there but for the grace of God, go I. In other people, you have more compassion for them. You realize all of us have the capability of doing incredibly wicked things. And just because we've served the Lord all these years doesn't mean that we can't make a choice to really mess up and do bad things. But when we see that we reach out to other human beings as an affirmation of their value and worth, we have this truth written on the wall in our office when clients come in to see that we believe everybody's made in the image of God and worthy of honor and respect. I think that's something that our society, on whatever sides of whatever aisle or discussion, really has lost. That when you speak to a human being, you're speaking to an image bearer of God. Speak accordingly. Especially in marriage. No matter what your spouse has done, they still bear the image of God in them. And they're worthy of honor and respect, because when you show them honor and respect, you're showing that to God. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. And in relationships, that makes a huge change. I think there's 7 characteristics that reflect what the image of God in humans is. First, we are spiritual beings. We are personal beings with uniqueness, personality, self-consciousness. We are moral beings. We have a sense of right and wrong in us. We are relational beings with God and others. We are rational beings. That intellectual intimacy I was talking about. The ability to think, to know, to learn. We're emotional beings. And we are creative beings. Not ex nihilo, that's out of nothing. God is the only one that can create out of nothing. But we can take stuff and make stuff in a way that is pretty incredible. That these characteristics, and this isn't an exhaustive list, I think the more I study, and I had to do a lot of this studying because it was a part of my doctoral research, like why would we do reconciliation in relationships? I see, as I saw, yeah, it really has to do with they're worth the effort. Relationships, as God designed it, are incredible. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know anything about God. He is so incredible in depth in all directions. I feel like a kindergartner each time I try to think about who God is and His love for me. But like a kindergartner, I get giddy at times, just knowing like He loves me. He loves me even when I mess up. Because His love isn't based on my actions. It's not based on how good I was. It's that it was given to me before I could do anything good towards Him. Before I could do anything. This is a picture of a diagram of the Old Testament temple, or the New Testament, the temple in Jerusalem. This is how I've come to view us as human beings. That as relational beings, we are a temple. We're told our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament. And as relational beings, you have different courts in our lives. You have the outer court. It says the women's hall here. That was in the temple. That was where women and Gentile believers could come. They couldn't go any further than that. So lots more people could be in the outer court. In our lives, we have some people that we're in relationship at a distance. You still are in relationship with them, but they're not real close. As you go in further, fewer people can go into that court. In our lives, as you come in closer, there's fewer people in that. Then you come up into the holy place in here. And then you have the Holy of Holies. In the Holy of Holies, only one man was allowed into the Holy of Holies. If anybody other than the high priest ever went into the Holy of Holies, God said, I will strike him dead. He said, if the high priest goes in the Holy of Holies any other day other than the Day of Atonement, which I forgot to look on the calendar, that's September, October, beginning of time on the Jewish calendar. Right around this time is when Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. If the high priest went in there any other day, God said, I'll strike him dead. He said if the high priest goes in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement with any sin in his life, guess what's going to happen? God's going to strike him dead. And if I'm reading Leviticus in my devotions, and I read when God gave him the outfit on out. And if that tinkling stops for very long, tug a little bit. And if nothing pulls back, they go start pulling it out because God struck him dead. And if you go in there to pick up his body, God's going to strike you dead. So just pull the rope. It seems like God is saying there's something really special about what's in the Holy of Holies. We know in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant was in there. In the Ark of the Covenant, we have the tablets of the testimony, the 10 Commandments in there. We have a jar of manna, reminding of God's provision miraculously for 40 years in the wilderness. We have Aaron's staff that budded, showing that God had selected him as the high priest. It was the most holy place in the nation. And that's where one human and God met. I believe in our lives that the Holy of Holies has a similar value. And in our Holy of Holies, the most valuable, the most holy thing in our lives is kept. I believe that's the image of God in our life. That in the core of who we are, the Holy of Holies is in there. And it is to be protected. It is the place where only one human and God meet. Anybody else that's allowed into your Holy of Holies becomes competition with God and violates the first commandment. Now, many Christians mistakenly think that allowing your spouse into the Holy of Holies, allowing them to speak to your fundamental value and worth, somehow honors God. I would submit to you that it doesn't. Because more important than your marriage is your relationship with God himself. And that if you allow your spouse to speak to your fundamental value and worth, you allow them to do what only God has the right to do. And what often will happen is they'll do what we humans do when we're given a whole lot of power. We'll use it to our own advantage. And if you allow your spouse in there, you need to kick them out. The Holy of Holies in the temple was sectioned off by a curtain. You read when Jesus died, that curtain was torn from top to bottom. In this image of the temple that I envision, there isn't a curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the rest. There's a vault door. Or better yet, a picture that I uniquely have, probably nobody else has. I retired out of Great Falls, Montana. It's a nuclear missile base throughout the country of Montana. the state of Montana, we have silos out there. And as a chaplain, I go visit all the people out there. And I got to go down, way down underneath to the capsule where missileers sit all the time down there. And that capsule that they're in is designed to withstand a nuclear blast at the surface, so that they can launch, if needed be, even if a nuclear blast happens. That door is about, if I remember right, it's something like 7 tons. And it's an incredible feat of engineering because you can close it with one finger. Counterweighting and everything, it's incredible. That's the picture of what I see on the Holy of Holies in our lives. When that vault door is closed, you can't push it in. A nuclear blast won't push it in. You can open it from the inside. You can push it out. In fact, no human being has the power to force their way into your Holy of Holies. The only way they can come in is for you to open it up and let them come in. And I would suggest to you that you need to keep that closed when you're in there meeting with God. That your spouse should be in the holy place, uniquely. But that Holy of Holies is reserved for one human and God. That nobody speaks to your fundamental value and worth except for your Creator who put that value there. Now, God, in creating us like this, created us with 2 fundamental, I call them attachment questions, because we're created for relationships to be attached. These 2 fundamental questions are asked by human beings from birth through all of life. A baby's first cries are really asking these 2 questions. Are you there for me? Can I count on you? We need these questions to be answered yes. If they're not for a baby's cries, the baby dies. If the cries, are you there for me? Can I count on you? If the answer is no, the baby will die before long. It used to be the prevailing theory in counseling 20 plus years ago was that these are child development questions. Once you reached maturity, you didn't need to ask these questions anymore. But the research over the last 20 years, I believe, has shown the truth that it's always been that, is these are human questions. These aren't just human children. Because as adults, we still ask these questions throughout life. And to our spouse, the question that we ask every interaction is, are you there for me and can I count on you? And anytime the answer is no, it creates anxiety in us. We need to know you have somebody that's there for you. As we're drawn to a close, I want to show you some common attachment needs that we have. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are human needs that we have. A need for acceptance, a need for closeness, a need for understanding, to feel important, to feel loved. Within marriage, need for your spouse to reflect to you the good things about you. But you could replace spouse with parent, sibling, boss. We need to feel like, do you see good things about me? And a need for appreciation, that we feel valued. We're made to ask these questions throughout life. The only way these can be answered is in relationship. I would say because of our complexity, and I believe because we're made in the image of God, we have relationships within ourselves. Probably not the only one that talks to myself. Well, part of me wants Mexican, or part of me wants Italian food. Yeah, that's the real thing. Like within me, I have different parts that want different things. David wrote, "Why are you downcast, my soul?" Well, he's talking to a part of him in that complexity. So within ourselves, we have these same needs. Do you accept yourself? Do you understand yourself? But when those needs are not met, they generate very powerful attachment fears. Some of those fears are being rejected, a fear of being abandoned, of not measuring up or being a failure, of not being accepted or valued, of being unlovable, or being controlled. When these fears come up, they motivate us to respond. But these are based on fear. And our body, and I can't go into all the physiological changes, to know that in our sympathetic nervous system, which is our system that is fight, flee, or freeze, our defenses, our self-defenses that are intended to protect us from physical danger. You have a wild animal coming at you. You really want your sympathetic nervous system to be tip-top shape in there. But we don't respond to psychological or emotional danger differently than we do physical danger. Our sympathetic nervous system activates there too. And what it does is it protects self by getting everybody that's not self away. So these fears, when you do what just comes natural when you have that fear, is you do something that pushes everybody away, everybody that's not me. That's a threat, because this is protect self. This is what a drowning man will do. He will drown the person who's trying to rescue them, because logic isn't a part of it. It's about protect self. And if I get on top of that thing coming over to me, then my nose is higher out of the water. Because that's the problem when you're drowning. Your nose is going below the water. If you climb on top of this other thing, you get higher out of the water. But if you do that, it makes it less likely for those needs to be met. Because if I push my spouse away by doing some really nasty things that fear will drive me to do, if I bite her head off, Terry is less likely to come over and say, "Can I give you a hug?" But at times of feeling disconnected to people that are important to you, what we really need to know is, are you still there for me? Can I count on you? But if I do what comes natural, I make that less likely to happen. What we're going to continue talking about these next couple of weeks is how to do what doesn't come natural. But what God can help you to do is to do something better that will be based on trust, that I can trust you even when I feel disconnected. I can tell you, I feel really alone. I feel really discouraged. I feel really isolated. Can you help me with that? Knowing the answer is yes. Your spouse, if you've gone to the point where you've married this person, they have what it takes to comfort you, to help you not feel alone. But what that question really is an invitation. Will you please do that? Do you want to make that easier or harder? I would suggest you make it easier by responding in a way that honors God. And we'll talk about that next week. Let me encourage you this week as you're going to do life and you're going to have possibly some of these fears that have been activated and raised up, to pause, think about it, and pray and ask for God's help to not respond in the way that comes natural. To respond viewing this other person as an image bearer of God. When you talk to your kids, when you talk to your boss, when you talk to your employees, and every human that you talk to this week, view them as an image bearer of God and respond to them as if you were responding to God himself. And see what happens. See what happens to the relationships. They may bite your head off in return. So if you're doing it so that they will do the same to you, you're not living by the golden rule. The golden rule is do to others what you would have them do to you. You take the first step.